everyone. My name is Loredana and I'm a recent graduate from the World Heritage Studies program at BTU, a technical university based in Cottbus, Germany. I was also part of the BTU Localized Hub, which I hope many of you attended. Today, I would like to introduce you to an adapted version of my master's thesis, which was focused on the right to free, prior, and informed consent in the context of the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. Here, I try to provide a simplified version of my research by presenting this indigenous right in the framework of the heritage field at large. My presentation will firstly give an overview of the objectives of my study to give you an idea of what I researched in particular throughout my thesis. Then I will explain better the meaning and implication of the indigenous right to free, prior, and informed consent, which will be called FPIC from now on, together with its legal evolution and some gaps I found in the course of my literature review. I will also therefore focus on the World Heritage field, outlining a brief situation analysis and providing some examples of heritage sites that, in my opinion, successfully implemented FPIC and consultation mechanisms. Afterwards, I will discuss the issues and potential mitigation measures related to the practical application of FPIC in our field, and in the end, of course, I will discuss the limitation of my studies. The objective of my study, as I said, are related to this indigenous right. First of all, I decided to understand which could be the issues related to the application of FPIC in the World Heritage field, how could it be effectively assessed during the World Heritage evaluation cycle, and here, during this presentation, I will try to give you a glimpse of what I found, and in the end also if FPIC mechanisms in place in other organizations can be applicable to World Heritage. I will not discuss this point due to time constraints, but it's important for you to know that FPIC, it's actually very well known, especially in extractive industries, in the private sectors, especially in regions such as Latin America, Africa, and Asia. My thesis overall tried to operate some reflections on FPIC and also to give some recommendations for practitioners. Let's now dive into what FPIC actually means. Free, prior, and informed consent is an indigenous right that says that indigenous communities have to be consulted and grant their consent regarding projects and policies affecting their lands and livelihoods. During an ECOSOC workshops taking place in 2005, the international community decided to go into detail regarding the different components of this right. Here we see that this consent, which is actually the core of this right, has to be free from any sort of manipulation, pressure, or violence. So indigenous people need to give this consent out of their will. Then this consent has to be sought prior to the start of the project. It cannot be throughout the design process of this project. It has to be at the very beginning, because if indigenous peoples and communities say that they do not want this project or policy in their lands, technically such projects shouldn't take place. Then communities need to be very well informed so that they can take an informed decision on the project. And in the end, the main objective of this right is to establish consultation processes that lead to consent. In the literature-based research, I selected conventions, declarations, and documents mainly in the UN framework. As I said, though, there are a lot of policies and guidelines related to the private sector. The literature review covered the evolution of this principle from its first wordings as free and informed consent. As you can hear, there's no prior component in ILO 169, which is one of the ILO convention in 1989, until the most recent wordings as free, prior, and informed consent, for instance, in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2008. You can also just Google this convention. There are written here in their shortened form and check how FPIC is tackled. Anyways, even though, and despite its presence in the international framework, it's very well established, FPIC still has a lot of controversies. And during my literature review, I found some gaps that you can see here at the bottom of the slide. First of all, the unclear establishment of the right to veto. There is the right to say no to projects. The presence of Western biases, especially concerning the identification of indigenous peoples, and also the acceptance of collective rights, because in the Western world, human rights are on an individual basis, while indigenous communities tend to have a collective view of their individualities. And then there also a blurred distinction between consultation and consent, which is actually a pillar of FPIC. FPIC says that consultation processes are vital, but consent need to be provided. Here I'm skipping what in my thesis was related to the private sector and other FPIC mechanisms in place in different organizations, but here I would like to just dive into the World Heritage field. In my thesis, I gave a very detailed overview of indigenous rights and in particular consent in the context of World Heritage. Well, here I decided to be very brief so that also those people that are not familiar with this arena can a little bit understand or maybe can be triggered to know more. So the 1972 Convention for the Protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage provides the global guidelines for the safeguard of our World Heritage, as we all know. The most famous outcome is, of course, the World Heritage List, in which every year properties are inscribed. The convention is internally guided by different policies, by the operational guidelines, which set the path for the practical implementation of the convention. So regarding human rights, indigenous peoples, and sustainable development, it's really important to mention that in 2015, in the World Heritage arena was adopted a policy for the integration of a sustainable development perspective into the processes of the World Heritage Convention, which you see here, and it introduced important topics such as indigenous peoples and human rights. Then, as I mentioned, these operational guidelines are actually let's say the Bible of our field. They also they are revised and updated consistently, but in 2015 and 2019, important introduction related to FPIC were made, and in particular, FPIC should be sought during the nomination process, so when state party decide to nominate new sites, also in tentative list. So state parties, before nominating a site, they have to have a sort of inventory of sites in their country, and also public consultations should take place. So here we try the heritage field try to be consistent to international standards regarding FPIC and indigenous peoples, and it's very important also to acknowledge this. Although, of course, a lot of work needs to be made because these changes were introduced just last year. And then in the end, it's very important also to mention the establishment of an international Indigenous Peoples Forum on World Heritage. So in most recent nomination cycles, there have been different indigenous sites that were nominated after the consent of indigenous communities was granted. For instance, we have here the property of Writing of Stone and Pimachuinaki in Canada, where also management systems include indigenous peoples, and the values of the sites actually revolve around indigenous culture. It's a very important statement and revolution. And finally, the case of Butch Beam in Australia was exceptional because here the nomination of the site started from the indigenous communities themselves, who had previously been educated on World Heritage matters and prepared the nomination dossiers, of course, with the support of the local governments and the international experts, but actually the efforts started from them. These cases are really important testimonies on how heritage sites worldwide can function and actually are quite enriched by the consent given by local communities. And actually the inclusion of civil society in decision-making processes leads to positive outcomes. It's important here to mention that in these three cases, I mean, there are different in the World Heritage List, but in these three cases, indigenous communities are also part of the management plan. Then I also wanted to present you the case of Colonial, which is an example that does not concern indigenous groups, but local communities. As I said at the beginning, different scholars advanced the good practice of establish consultation mechanisms and also seek the consent of local communities, not just indigenous. Colonial is a World Heritage Site that is located in southern Italy. You can see the map here, which is close to Naples. The property has an actually interesting history, since it was almost forgotten after the 80s in favor of its neighbor Pompeii, which I'm sure all of you already know. It was also actually physically, the site, the historical site, was physically divided from the modern city of Colonial, which was actually not benefiting at all from having heritage sites, and its inhabitants were completely left out from any sort of conservation, management, or any sort of process related to this site. In recent years, however, thanks to foreign institutions, Colonial initiated new programs involving the local communities in decision-making processes, and actually these new actors cared a lot about the rights and also the needs of these communities, even outside the heritage field. This actually was a holistic approach that designed initiatives and programs with the local communities and not just for the local community. Communities became at the core of any sort of management effort. And of course, this leads to sustainable management and development, especially in the long run, because the local communities felt a new feeling and sense of attachment to this site. And also the surrounding urban environments, of course, benefited as well from this new relationship. This consultation mechanisms and this involvement of local communities in decision-making processes, in management plans, and in any sort of activity related to the site actually contributes also to the underlying principles of free, prior, and informed consent. That means actually that this good practice should be extended in any sort of heritage, be it cultural or natural site, because local communities are actually, as we all know here, because we have the future. I know that we are the future of our field again. We know that local communities are the core of our efforts. These sites cannot just live without the surrounding social and urban texture. So of course, I wanted just to introduce, maybe if you didn't know this site, you can actually do a little bit of research. A lot of papers were published and were made public for all those research that are interested in how community involvement and community-centered approach are actually benefiting heritage sites all over the world in the long run. So we now go to FPIC in practice. As I mentioned in the beginning, my thesis also wanted to be quite practical. I wanted to understand what are the underlying issues related to a practical application of FPIC, because FPIC has different framework in place in different organizations. There's sometimes checklists, sometimes there's guidelines, sometimes there are timetables, and all of them try to establish some sort of fixed rules. My thesis, as I said, was focused on the World Heritage Convention. And in the World Heritage Convention, these two organizations that you see here, IUCN and ICOMOS, are called advisory bodies, together with ICROM, which is the third one. But these two in particular are the ones in charge of evaluating new properties. IUCN for the natural sites, ICOMOS for cultural sites, and they both work together for mixed sites and cultural landscapes. During my thesis, I also carried out some expert interviews from heritage experts from also these two organizations in order to understand what happens when they go on missions to evaluate new properties. My research, also thanks to content analysis and other literature review, retrieved these 5 underlying issues. First of all, the identification of relevant rights holders can be very tricky, especially in contexts where there are different communities. Sometimes there can be conflict, or the government comes across experts and communities. This is also quite tightly linked to understand land tenures and land rights. There can be governance systems in place, customary systems in place that heritage experts might not be super familiar with. And it's very hard to understand who are the rights holders, who are the duty bearers, what's going on the side sometimes. Then, of course, the natural sources, um, especially in the context of World Heritage nominations, this years are prepared by state parties and governmental agencies. Therefore, the source might be biased. Issues of representation. In case we have in a context different stakeholders, different right holders, different communities, what happens if 90% of the community says yes to a project, to a policy, to a management plan, and 1% or 10% of them says no? What happens? We still don't know. These are just open questions, but these are some definitely some issues that we should take into account. We have to take into account all the voices and all the rights holders. And then in the end, this is just related to the World Heritage field, state parties requirements. We still don't know as of today what state parties need to provide to the World Heritage Center for future nominations. But these issues, I wanted to highlight this because in our field, it's important also that we put human rights at the core of our efforts. And here can be some of the issues that we might encounter during our daily activities, not just related to World Heritage, but heritage in general. Then I very humbly try to outline some potential ways forward and potential mitigation measures. Of course, I contextualize these ones in the context of, again, the convention, but here we can see how these tools can help our work even outside the World Heritage field. We have social and human rights impact assessments. We know that environmental impact assessments are the ones that are performed the most in our field. But we need to know also there are other types of impact assessments, and social and human rights ones can be also quite useful. Then we can ask or carry out participatory mapping with the local communities in order to understand the land tenure, in order to understand the cultural asset of a site, of a place. Then we can carry out more interviews. Interviews are actually very important, sometimes are very underrated during management plans. We need to have all the voices of all the stakeholders and all the actors in a place. Then we can establish new partnerships. We are not alone in managing a site. We can establish new partnerships with other NGOs, with communities, with also UN bodies working with human rights or indigenous issues. These are just some, and I during my thesis, I just hope that these could be just some triggers for further reflections and further ways forward. Then, of course, my study was limited. We're here, either students or emerging professionals. We maybe wrote our thesis not long ago, and of course, we're not having all the answers to our big questions. Here, I listed only some of the limitations of my study. First of all, the legal framework was way too complex for a master student, and also the definition of FPIC were quite vague, contradictory. It was really hard to understand what was going on, what is actually going on. And then, of course, very important, I am not Indigenous myself, so I always took some sort of distance to the matter. And that's also why I decided to tackle Indigenous rights from a procedural and legal point of view. But unfortunately, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get all of experts from the World Heritage Center and Indigenous peoples. So therefore, unfortunately and regrettably, my works provides a Eurocentric and limited point of view. Then I just wanted to, I'm wrapping up very, very quickly. My thesis was quite eye-opening in terms of our field. We always think that we are the good guys, but it's actually not always the case. Every year, dozens of environmental, indigenous, and conservation activists die everywhere in the world in the name of heritage conservation, in the name of natural conservation. And their rights are perpetually being violated. They are displaced, they are evicted, and they are killed. It's very important for us to put human rights as a core, because sometimes we forget about human rights in our field. There are not a lot of programs that I encountered related to conservation that actually have courses on human rights. Human rights are the basis of any sort of activities that we can have or we can carry out in these fields. So just want to highlight that we are not just the heroes, the heritage heroes, the cultural heroes. We can be the ones causing harm. And it's very important for us to take a step back and give to Indigenous peoples and give to local communities their right to say no, even if we think it's a wrong choice, because it's their heritage. Even if it's a global or world heritage, first of all, the local communities need to be part of our processes, because if if they are not part of it, first of all, they cannot thrive. The local environment cannot thrive. Sustainable development is not granted, and also financially speaking, there are a lot of costs related to solving conflicts, related to also a bad picture that can go in the whole world if human rights are violated, if we don't take into account local communities. And of course, again, I would like to invite everyone in the course of our career to put also the rights of any sort of local community. Let's start talking more with them. Let's start to carry out more people-centered approaches, and also let's start to ask first communities if they're okay what we're carrying out in a site. What are the values that they attach to the site? Let's establish fixed consultation mechanisms so they can always be part of it, because not everyone is aware of what's going on in their own homes. So if you're interested in other aspects of FPIC, such as its private corporations, private components, also the World Heritage Systems, or in general Indigenous rights, I'll be very happy to respond to your answers and also try my best to satisfy your curiosity. Thank you.